even you yourself may be unable to work for a period of time. Now, in the event that leaders and other key members of the organization are not available for urgent decision-making and crucial tasks, now you as the CFO should be able to consider how the chain of command and authority will shift among the key staff members. Now, from aspects of authority, from aspects of protocols, basically protocols for access to critical files, to retasking other staff, preparing for business continuity, of course, at an unprecedented scale, while at the same time maintaining proper internal controls becomes one critical aspect of as an accountant. So as staff and their families can be significantly stressed, basically under the current circumstances, it is also important to work with the human resource department to be able to provide some key resources for support, thus taking care of your talent, or rather the key human resource becomes a top priority for the chief finance executive. Now, support virtualization of the finance and other functions is also a key strategy under this role, where you need to provide shelter in place. And of course, social distancing basically requires companies to virtualize their workspace. And of course, finance can likely be virtualized more readily than other functions, such as, of course, manufacturing and production operations. So CFOs need to support this change and, of course, lead by example, working with HR, IT departments. They should be able to determine ways in which to be able to help their staff connect online and evaluate or elevate employee engagement overall. So virtualization of work can potentially undermine the traditional resources of work satisfaction. Furthermore, you need to spur discussions on ambiguous issues, which are usually best done in person, and thus will have to take place virtually, especially aspects of financial decisions that now need to be done virtually rather than physically. So care must be taken to avoid misrepresentations in virtual work setups where visual and other social interactions cues may not be so obvious. Then, of course, provide IT with critical resources and funding for virtualization, in that as entities, you do not have proper systems in place for full virtual access to critical systems and data, especially when you are dealing with a major database management system. So CFO should work with their CIOs to support, or the chief IT support, so that they can be able to provide essential remote access to key systems and data, while at the same time maintaining proper security of information. So staff in this case will likely need remote training and support to help them adapt to the new systems and, of course, process to their work. So as a CFO, your key role here is basically capacity building. You're supposed to provide training, or rather facilitate for training on how such home-based workstations can be able to efficiently and effectively be managed. Then, of course, minimization of infection risks for staff on premises. Here we are talking about some staff, especially in the production and operations, will not be able to work from home. So this constraint will require new ways of organizing the workspace to be able to provide for social distancing and, of course, safe handling of material and effective and efficient disinfecting of the workplace. So CFOs can play a key role in planning for the resources that might be needed for their institutions to reorganize their workspaces. Now, the second role is on liquidity governance. Now, a foremost priority for any chief finance officer is to ensure enough cash and liquidity for their company so that they can stay afloat during such uncertainties. Now, even more so for the finance officers of highly leveraged institutions, they have to take into effect aspects of liquidity governance. Now, we have seen that in recent weeks, how the cost of financing has continued to rise. And of course, new stock issues through public markets have become unattractive, given deadlines in global or rather even national stock prices, especially in the NSE. And of course, as a result also of the market volatilities and challenges in forecasting earnings, which have become too uncertain. So central banks have authorized massive injections of capital to provide liquidity in credit markets. Now, governments have also announced various fiscal stimuli to be able to support citizens and companies through this current crisis. So for some institutions, credit ratings could be downgraded due to decelerating cash flows, making new capital borrowings more and more expensive, or rather unobtainable. So in this environment, you as a chief finance officer or rather an accountant should consider some key issues so as to secure and control liquidity, as well as manage the financing and credit rating relationships for your institutions. Now, key among them is modeling the cash flow. Now, modeling cash flow can help you as a finance officer identify how many weeks of liquidity the institution has under stressed business scenarios. So you'll be able to carry out scenario analysis and understand how or for how long the organization can be able to stay afloat before the red flags can now pop up. Next, you need to revisit financing and liquidity. Now, the finance officers and treasurers are refreshing their understanding of current debt arrangements, especially considering whether there might be potential breaches of financial covenants, and of course, material adverse changes and cross-default triggers that at the end of the day may compromise access to core funding and liquidity. So as an accountant, you need to be proactive with financiers so as to seek waivers, so as to renegotiate repayment periods, and to be able to get ahead of potential uncertain issues. Then, of course, centralize cash release decisions or with the CFO and treasurer. Here, you need to be able to identify the multiple places where cash may be released, and of course, prioritize which payment types and vendors and of course suppliers are to be paid. Especially, you're looking at those organizations or those stakeholders who are key priorities for the institution. Now, diversify and secure new credit. Now, the chief finance officer may want to expand their network of banks or even financing sources so as to secure additional lines of credit if access to new bank loans diminishes and of course covenants or rather previous engagements become more restrictive. So in the near term, CFOs might consider taking advantage of government loans and grants, and of course you can also explore the money market and look at bonds so that you can be able to show up access to financing. Then monitor and of course manage your receivables. Now in this sense, you have customers and vendors who generally lengthen their time frames for payment as they confront the current cash flow and credit challenges. So you need to closely manage receivables and of course quickly deal with disputes that can help mitigate the risks of payment defaults and delays. So accountants may need to work with credit collection institutions, treasury. They may also need other finance teams to be able to daily monitor and ensure strong cash flows, and of course to be able to identify the impacts on revenue. Now, on the other hand, companies also may opt to take a larger float by extending payment terms to their suppliers. Now, this will go a long way in trying to bolster the supplier relationships, and thus will lead also to liquidity management. Especially, we are going to slow down our credit periods so that we can lengthen them, and thus at the end of the day, the operating cycle ends up being done what? Lengthened, to be able to give us that breathing space to source for financing, to be able to do what? To pay our suppliers. Now, work closely with your suppliers. We know very well that some critical suppliers are likely to be vulnerable to bankruptcy during this period. So business continuity may hinge on arranging alternate sources of supply. So here you prepare critical vendors or ensuring sufficient credit for suppliers so that you can continue, they can be able to continue with operations. Now, talk about third-party risk assessments. And of course, management should be able to become critical over the next 6 to 12 months of this post-pandemic the post-pandemic period. So we are looking at the year 2021 between July to December. And lastly, try leverage tax planning. Now, tax planning can be vital to reducing cash outlays and of course help us preserve cash. Now, taking action in several areas can help the CFO conserve cash in the nearer term. For example, you as an accountant can consider repatriating cash from market segments that are not your forte. So cash tax planning with respect to analyzing and filing refund claims from our taxman, and of course, accelerating deductions or even deferring revenues will go a long way in providing the organization with the leverage they need. Now, in addition to that, you also need to take advantage of the stimuli packages that were on offer or that are still on offer to be able to re-strategize on the financing options that we can take advantage of as a company. Now, the next role is stakeholder engagement. Now, as if the CFO and the accountants need to communicate frequently and clearly with their major stakeholders. We know very well in times of uncertainty, it is especially important to have clear and frequent communications with critical stakeholders. So for the CFO, this may mean daily communication across the executive leadership, as well as with the audit committee chair. And of course, you can also have engagement with other board members, depending on the state of the institution, and with regards also to cash flow and liquidity aspects. So the COVID-19 crisis will also likely require more frequent communication with our financial institutions. that is the banks, or even private equity investors, as well as our employees. Now, implementing an easy-to-read format or dashboards of developments to keep critical stakeholders informed, and of course, to clarify which issues require immediate attention and which ones can be positioned or rather can be postponed, can go a long way in helping keep calm the key stakeholders. Now, establishing appropriate technical and communication support can also help reduce the burdens of preparing for and executing this stakeholder engagement. So, communicating with investors during these times is also critical. You know very well that uncertainty is the last thing that investors want. So providing them with information within the regulatory guidelines about what actions the company is going to take to deal with the crisis and how they might impact on performance becomes key or essential. So in the wake of the pandemic, many organizations will have to alter their earnings guidance. Now, we know very well that for some institutions, unprecedented volatility may be an opportunity to shift away from quarterly earning guidances and focus on long-term growth. So you'll see companies reviewing their dividend policies so that they are not focusing more on liquidity, but rather they want to look at the recovery of the organization and the long-term growth of that particular company. Now, regulators are also key stakeholders whom we need to communicate to at this time. So we know very well that our key regulators in the past have been able to issue statements related to financial reporting, related to financial statement disclosures, and of course, these ones we have to come up with an engagement forum on how we can be able to proceed moving forward with some of the impacts of that will be caused or that will result as a result of these reviewed guidances and guidelines. So as institutions, we know very well that we need to be abreast with our key regulators. We need to follow bullets on what the CBK gives. We need to follow bullets on what the ministry is giving. We need to follow bullets on what each sectoral regulators are supposed to communicate to us with regards to the changing guidelines. Now, the next role is on operations. Optimization. We know that beyond any virtualization, both the finance and of course the business operations will have to adjust and of course step up to address changes in demand during this crisis. Now, consider what needs to change in how the company operates and what opportunities can be seized during this pandemic. So as a chief executive, some crucial steps need to be considered for you to be able to drive some of these key operational improvements. Now, first among them is shifting the forecasting models to scenarios. Now, what do you mean by this? We know that the rapid deceleration of business will make forecasting near-term revenues and earnings challenging. So existing forecast models based on normal work and of course in-person interactions may no longer be valid. So as finance officers, we will have to drive scenario planning so that we can Sorry? So as finance officers, we will have to drive scenario planning so that we can guide revenue and cash flow forecasts. We also need to plan for capital utilization and of course management. We need to create optionalities. So modeling capital expenditure should focus on the timing and size of investments that we need to position the enterprise for a rebound. And of course, we need to create that competitive advantage as well as on weighing how much certain reductions could hurt the competitive positioning of the organization. So chief finance officers should also consider establishing cross-functional SWAT teams, or rather functional teams comprised of stakeholders from within, stakeholders externally, and of course, the key functions within the organization that can be able to help understand and identify the inputs that will be critical for purposes of scenario planning. Now, secondly, is reducing the enterprise cost. Now, we know very well that given the severity of the drop in demand and of course the need to preserve cash, many organizations have already begun enterprise cost reduction initiatives. And of course, procurement is a key area where organizations can be able to do what? To reduce cost and of course gain efficiencies. So the pandemic crisis, or rather the pandemic, also provides an impetus for restructuring and consolidation to achieve efficiencies, such as moving to a virtualized shared service model. So you need to judicially execute outsourcing contracts so that you can be able to allow companies, or you can be able to allow the organization to shift high fixed costs to variable costs that of course can adjust with trends in the economy. So as future corporate organizations, needs may fall due to increased working remotely initiatives. So there may be opportunities to reduce what? The leased spaces. And of course, we can also go ahead and sell some of the key what? We can be able to sell some of these key assets, especially the ones that are under, that are not under the leasing arrangements. Then thirdly, rationalize and diversify procurement. Now, given the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains, this may be the time to diversify our supplier sources so that we can be able to lock in critical forward contracts. So CFOs potentially have the opportunity to drive new categories, new bargains across different asset categories, especially from raw materials to real estate. So during this unsettling period, it also may be a time to be able to buy options, or rather forward contracts at low prices. And but by doing so, it will require careful consideration of the supplier's ability to survive the pullback that will be created by the second wave of the COVID-19 crisis. So the buyers across the country know very well that the dollar has been able to gain against most currencies, and thus commodity prices internationally, or those that we are going to trade internationally, will have dropped what? Will have dropped substantially in the international market, but as a result of our depreciated currencies, they will tend to be what? Expensive on our end. So we can be able to capitalize on such forward contracts and gain on what? On these depreciated values in key what? On key currencies. Now, Improving the pricing discipline is another key strategy for this particular role. Now, price execution at many organizations is decentralized and of course inconsistent across the salespeople and even customers. So a downturn provides the opportunity to catalyze and execute a rational pricing and organizational strategy. Now, consider that a 1% increase, for example, in price can yield an upwards of 10% in operating profit across board. So generally, stronger discipline around pricing can also help protect against the downside, or even as customers put greater pressure on margins during this particular severe downturn, or rather the pandemic. And lastly, as a CFO, rethink the portfolio of assets that we have. Now, depending on the duration of the crisis, some organizations may not be able to secure enough cash to ride it out into the long term, possibly forcing them into bankruptcy. They will also be forced to restructure or at times liquidate. So CFOs need to immediately consider what assets they will dispose of and how to restructure their portfolio to best survive and maintain value. Now, for those organizations with strong balance sheets, this could be an ideal time for strategic acquisitions. Asset values have dropped considerably, and of course, highly leveraged targets have become more and more vulnerable. So, new opportunities would accredit to earnings, and this could emerge for acquiring new organizations. Now, prior to COVID-19 crisis, many organizations accumulated cash, and the dearth of the mergers and acquisition candidates at that particular time had affordable valuations, which often resulted in cash being returned to investors through share buybacks and of course through the dividend policies. So as a chief executive, we need to rethink the pool of portfolio, or rather the pool of assets that we are managing within our key portfolios. The next role is basically risk management. Managing risk is key. In addition to your financial duties, you will have to keep a sharp eye on risk management and stewardship. Now, some of the risks, or rather some of the key risks that need to be managed directly, of course, we have some issues to do with the internal controls and fraud. We know very well that downturns and recessions in general can disrupt our supplies and receivables. So as we continue to lay off and come up with the cost reduction strategies, organizations will become increasingly vulnerable to failures of internal controls, especially given the stretched and the disengagements, and of course the off or the working from home office plans. This will lead to key risks that will end up compromising the internal control mechanism of the organization. So the finance officers should be especially vigilant about fraud, as these failures can they can be able to add to substantial costs over and above the tolerable risks that we can be able to manage as organizations. Then talk about supplier and customer failures as risks. As a result of the downturns and recessions in general, we can be able to disrupt supplies or receivables. So diversifying and of course securing suppliers and monitoring customer payments, this can help mitigate the risks. So third-party risk management remains critical so that we can be able to mitigate the veracity of this particular type of risk. Then thirdly, talk about cyber attacks. As companies virtualize their workforce and of course creating more and more external access points to their systems, they are potentially becoming more vulnerable to cyber risks, especially including the risk of data theft, the risk of ransomware, and other malware attacks. Thus, vigilance and investment in cybersecurity will continue to increase in importance across the organization and of course across each and every major sector. So at the same time, companies will be able to face indirect risks in their global economy that can have severe impacts depending on the duration and depth of the contagion. For example, talk about failure of policy interventions. We know very well that the public sector, especially government and central bank, are injecting massive amounts of cash into their respective economies so that they can be able to stimulate demand. Now, this is unclear whether the moves will be enough to offset unemployment or whether they will work to stimulate and reignite demand in the economy, while at the same time, many individuals must be able to do what? They must be able to seek for alternatives so that they can shelter themselves against the adversities of the pandemic. Now, furthermore, it is uncertain whether some of these stimulus packages will be sufficient to instill confidence into investors in a timely way to be able to provide credit and of course open up liquidity in our markets. So policy intervention failures becomes one of the key risks that as CFOs, we need to be able to do what? We need to be able to provide mitigating avenues for them. Now, another issue or another risk is, of course, the risk of cascading. We know very well that studies across the globe have been done of risks that led to major drops in company valuations following recessions. Now, it was found that one risk often led to another interdependent risk. So in the key hyper-connected global economy, investors are beginning to understand critical interdependent risks that can be activated by the slowdown stemming of the pandemic. For example, could government borrowing to provide stimulus trigger national debt defaults that cascade through the financial system? Could governments of heavily indebted countries face limited access to what? To liquidity. So given the uncertainty of the depth and duration of the pandemic, and of course, the related economic impacts, we do not know what cascading risks will emerge over time. So as finance officers, we will have to continuously engage in scenario planning so that we can be able to identify which risks are more likely to impact the organization. Still, there will be risks that cannot be foreseen or easily mitigated, and thus requiring liquidity and of course the agility to be able to respond to them. So those are some of the critical strategies that will bolster the role of risk management for the accountant, or rather the finance officer. And the last role is on recovery planning. We need to plan for our recovery as organization so that we can be able to do what? We can be able to survive the post-pandemic environment. Now, although it is uncertain when the economy will start to recover from the impacts that have been caused by the pandemic, it is not too soon to think about your organization's future plans. Now, as social distancing makes this particular crisis a unique crisis, as accountants, we should consider exploring different recovery models so that we can be able to determine which markets and segments could bounce back fast. So the analysis can help in focusing investments and, of course, developing plans to be able to respond to this particular recovery. So such plans may include acquiring or even maintaining specific assets that could bolster an organization's recovery. Now, some key options other than this one might include fast filling critical talent needs. We know that generally, economic downturns and recessions often result to layoffs, furloughs, and even downsizing. Yet, organizations will likely continue to face the long-term talent shortages they have experienced in recent years, especially during and after the recovery. Now, a downturn presents an opportunity to hire critical talent from other organizations or even training institutions that may be forced to downsize as they deleverage. So, such institutions and, of course, experienced higher recruiting may also yield more qualified candidates at lower costs over the next coming periods post the pandemic. So we should be able to exploit recruitment strategies that involve looking for students from universities or training institutions who will be able to do what? Who will be able to accept, cut down remuneration packages. Now, next, you also need to have a selective product and, of course, service innovation. Now, we know very well that during drastic downturns or even recessions, research and development as a department suffers. But too much paring back can undermine the delivery of future products. So when we analyze some of the high-performing institutions that managed to navigate prior recessions, it was found that most of these institutions continue to innovate. They continue to introduce new products. They continue to position their products and services for growth. So the current crisis provides an opportunity to focus your research and development on products, services, and even packaging that is likely to be most attractive over the next several months. And of course, after the crisis has diminished. And lastly, talk about digital transformation. Now, many organizations were already undertaking digital transformation initiatives before COVID struck. Now, with the virtualization of the work and, of course, the possibility of its continued use, sustaining efforts to virtualize the workplace and operations may help companies better meet future needs. So after the COVID-19 crisis has abated, many consumers are, of course, likely to engage more in e-commerce. And thus, people may prefer to continue working remotely. So when this is managed well, virtualizing how and where people work could lead to improvements in productivity, as well as increasing the customer and workforce engagement. Lastly is decoupling, and of course, creating resilient supply chains. Now, the pandemic exposed the vulnerability of supply chains, especially when we looked at how it started in China, and later on, it trickled down to other countries across the globe. Now, consequently, companies or organizations will likely take steps to reconfigure their supply chain to be more resilient to future disruptions. So such steps could include more onshoring and nearshoring of production, greater automation, and of course, using additive manufacturing to be able to create new supply chain what? To be able to create new supply chain options. So during economic downturns, it is natural to focus on cost cutting. However, by staying the course on initiatives that are supposed to support the long-term growth, Chief Finance Officers can play a critical role in financing and positioning their organizations for recovery. Now, in conclusion, we are saying that given the uncertainty, as finance executives, we should be able to develop strategies that will help our organizations navigate this pandemic, especially using scenarios of different depth and duration. Now, planning should consider a range of scenarios from worst cases to best case scenarios, taking into consideration talent, and of course, operations, suppliers, customers, and our key stakeholders. And of course, the possibility that the pandemic could persist for an extended period and thus cascade to create other more risks. So, finance officers in organizations with strong balance sheets and reserves, they are likely to be positioned to seize opportunities, to innovate, outdistance, and even outmaneuver their competitors, and at the end of the day, grow more quickly in the ensuing recovery. Yet the duration and depth of contagion will still likely drive the recovery. So ultimately, an effective treatment protocol will provide the greatest benefit to secure the health of the organization and, of course, restore individual and investor confidence across our organizations. So, ladies and gentlemen, that should be the end of my presentation. I would now like to open the floor for further deliberations, feedback, and of course, any question and queries that you might be having. Thank you very much. Simon, over to you.
Oh, well. Thank you so much, CPA Aaron, for that very powerful series of insights. You've taken us through the presentation very well. And personally, I would also like to admit that you have really expressed yourself post. And I think without doubt that every delegate who has been following in the House actually taken every key point that you have said very well. So you are audible enough and very composed. I think we are very satisfied with the presentation. So I would also like to acknowledge many of the key points that you have been able to share with us. The underlying takeaway being CFOs to develop strategies to ride through these exposed vulnerabilities as a result of the pandemic. And of course, even if it means going as far as virtualizing on how and where people work, so that we can be more resilient in terms of just automating processes even as we try to achieve optimal growth down the road. So I believe maybe some of us might be having questions or comments. I can see we already have a comment on our chat box. And Zach is saying, complimenting on cyber attacks, the attacks find a fertile ground, even as we sustain talent virtually. I think that is very true. Thank you, Zach, for complimenting on the same. So if you have something to add or a comment or a question, this is the time. You can just raise your hand and then I'll pick you to share your opinion, your question, so that we can have our experts in the house led by CPA Aaron to answer on the same. Meanwhile, we are trying to keep time. I've been informed that CPA Aaron is needed somewhere else at exactly, I think, 1:20. So between now and 1:20, we can just utilize this chance to ask our questions and comment on the presentation. Anyone with a question or a comment? I'm waiting to see your hands up or comments on the chat box. Okay. So as we continue to think, maybe just a reminder, I want to also appreciate the turn up today. I could see a maximum of 62 attendants. So I would also like to remind you of the webinar that is coming next week. I'm going to share the link in the chat box so that we can take the opportunity to register. But also we decided to change our mode of registration. You realize that if you have trained with us before, you'll be receiving a text SMS every Monday, reminding you of the webinar that is scheduled in the course of the Wednesday of that current week, or the week that is active, so that you can register. So always ensure that on Monday you are alert on your SMS. We'll be sharing SMSs reminding us of the upcoming webinars so that you can easily register for that. And then so that you don't miss out. Meanwhile, let me just share the link for the upcoming webinar on the chat box as I wait any questions or comments. And after that, I think we'll be able to disperse for the day and be able to apply whatever we have been able to learn today, even as we continue to build and become better professionals and managers in our areas of expertise. I think I got the link. Let me just share. So we'll be looking at creative decision making and problem solving. Let me just share the link. So I have shared the link there. We can use this time to just make the registration. So seemingly, I don't see anyone's hand up so far, and also no questions on the chat box. And I will also just acknowledge CPA Francis for being grateful to Aaron, and of course, as Capable family, we are also grateful for CPA Aaron for that wonderfully planned and presented session. Thank you, CPA Francis. So I think at this time, I will let the team to be free to leave. And don't forget to subscribe or to just register to the webinar that is coming up next week. So with those very few or many remarks, I would like to thank once again all of us for showing up. We really appreciate every time you register to these events because you mean a lot, not only to us, but to the entire society. It means as professionals, we are keen on developing ourselves to ensure that we increase our capacities to deliver and of course, make the society a better place, even as we build a better future. So we really appreciate that, and we don't take any of your presence or these registrations for granted. And that is why we try every day to ensure that we do a better service to you and hear any concerns that you might have. If you might have something that you need to share, maybe confidentially, you can, of course, message me directly and see if we can work on it. Maybe it's a new topic that you think will be beneficial to the masses. You can also share the ideas, and I'll have my team sit down and carefully craft a material that we will and publicize and then have people register and take them through the session. So always ensure that you reach out to us in case of any training needs. Of course, also we hold physical trainings at our preferred venues, Mombasa, Kisumu. Don't forget to check out our calendar and of course, find a training that will be beneficial to you and your colleagues in the office or in the company. And then we have, you have us take you through the programs. And I also just want to remind you that I'll share the presentations. I can see one of the delegates have requested for the same. We will share the presentations together with the CPD certificates for this webinar and any other webinar that is coming ahead. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, CP Aaron. We really appreciate, and everyone else who has joined us today. So I think at this point, I will let us be at liberty to leave. If we feel we can chat with each other in the inboxes, that's still okay. But I'll let us leave so that we can work on other personal schedules in the course of the afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a blessed afternoon.